Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 448, July the 4th, 1980, and this is side one of the tape. The music, appropriately, is from the Dance Macabre, Saint-Saëns music, the Dance of Death. Maybe we should use that as a theme song for the tapes from now on instead of some of the musical shows from Broadway. Many people who take these tapes are concerned with investments. They have investments in savings in different trust funds or silver or gold or stock market investments. And they're interested in the opinions I have on world events because they do, of course, directly affect financial investments. There never seems to be, in my mind, enough concern over the lives. I very seldom count dollar and silver, but I count murders and genocide and deaths. And I think the perversion of the justice system and the arrogant genocide that is going on right now is so important. And, of course, the deaths are used to manipulate the market. If you don't follow the deaths, you can't follow your financial investments because massacres and deaths go along with fascism, and fascism is a nationalization and control of all the economy, and there is no free society when the banks are tied up by the government and the government owns and prints all of its own money and controls it the way it wants to, or closes the banks or takes control of the banks. The direct proportion of the amount of deaths and murders and genocides that takes place, to me, is an indication of the faulty economic system. The way the economy will fall is in direct proportion to the amount of deaths. And if that is true, then, of course, the economy is in a very shaky position today, and it always has been, and that became obvious to me as I began to study political assassinations and murders and genocides or the erasing of entire countries. There's a popular game on the campuses reported in the New York Times, June the 9th, 1980. It's called Killer, or it's a game on how to murder, and then one of the consequences of being the remaining murderer is that you have to commit your own suicide. This is from the New York Times, June the 9th, 1980. The story comes out of Ann Arbor, Michigan. Of course, Michigan is the home of Henry Ford, the granddaddy of the national, international conspiracies, Warren Burger, Gerald Ford, and various other prominent people that figure in these assassinations that I refer to so often. Ann Arbor, Michigan. Killer is a popular game for an increasing number of students in college as far west as the University of California in Los Angeles and Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the east. The strategy of the game is to kill. The novelty of it is that each player is simultaneously the assassin and also the victim. Killer was introduced at the University of Michigan 4 years ago by Lenny Pape, P-A-P-E. The current executioner of the game, Robert Cantor, is the coordinator at the university, and rules for the game are coming in, requests from all over the nation. In Michigan, the game is played at the East Quadrangle, in case you want to know where to play it. Out of 850 residents in this particular area of the school, 250 play its game in the runoffs, played it last year. If a victim sees his assassin in the act of the kill, he may kill the assassin in self-defense. When a person is killed, his name and picture are posted on the obituary board in the university there as part of the game. For a kill to be legal, it has to be witnessed by two other persons. You can't say that you killed somebody unless two people saw it. When one person is left in the game, when you get down to one person, that person is declared the winner, and as a result of being the winner, he must commit suicide. Not surprisingly, that then ends the game. The Michigan record is 15 kills by one person. There's a special award for the most ingenious kill. Once an assassin lured his target, this is in the game, to a United Parcel Service office and was wearing a borrowed uniform and killed the victim at the counter. The university housing official who supervises the East Quadrangle said there are no casualties or problems concerned with the game at the University of Michigan, and the game Killer is played usually from midterm finals and exams up to Thanksgiving. That's the time period it's played, and they want to explain the only dangerous part of the game is that it absorbs so much energy from the killer or the killed that it's hard to get schoolwork done. Killer is a collegiate cops and robbers game, spreading the campus. Now what happens is when they leave the campus, the winners of the kill, the people that are the finalists, can then be sought by the intelligence agency and used for organized crime because of their expertise in outwitting. In other words, it's an IQ test for plans of assassination on how to do it and how to get away with it. And then, of course, the famous suicides, such as Candy Jones was supposed to do, or Michael Protz, one of the men who formed Jonestown, called a press conference and shot himself while the men were present, went in the bathroom and killed himself, or George de Mohrenschildt, involved with the John Kennedy assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald shoots himself the day that the House Select Committee was supposed to interview him that afternoon. They're investigating the assassination of John Kennedy, and there have been endless suicides, a parade of suicides through the years. When the last person's left, after he's useful in killing all the others, then he's instructed to kill himself. The object of the popular game on campuses is to assassinate your opponents. That's the lead story, large letters that read in the New York Times, as they say, June the 9th, 1980. One of my favorite villains died this week. Very little notice in the newspapers. As a matter of fact, he died a week ago, and it wasn't in any of the national papers, and usually there's quite a good obituary service done by the Washington Post, the New York Times, particularly the New York Times, who so far have managed to leave this out of their newspaper. Walter Dornberger died in Hamburg, West Germany, reported July the 2nd, 1980 in the San Francisco Chronicle. They describe him this way. Walter Dornberger helped create Adolf Hitler's V-2 rocket bombs that bombarded London in the closing months of World War II. He died last week. He was 85. A general in the German army, he led the research of the secret Peenemünde testing site in the Baltic Sea. He emigrated to the United States after the war, and 2 years he was in an English prisoner of war camp. The details go on about the capabilities of the V-2 rocket. Then the obituary in the San Francisco Chronicle states, in the United States, the former general worked as an advisor to the U.S. Air Force. Later, he was made head of Bell Aerosystems Research Department, where he retired as vice president in 1965. He was vice president of Bell Helicopter Research at the time of the Kennedy assassination, 1963, November 1963. He retired 2 years later. But Walter Dornberger hired Michael Payne. Michael Payne was a research scientist, 3 generations from Harvard University, who lived in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Irving, Texas, and he was the host of Lee and Marina Oswald. It was Ruth Payne who drove Lee Harvey Oswald's wife, Marina, down to New Orleans while Lee was getting settled with the intelligence and network and the CIA in the New Orleans area prior to the assassination. She lived with the Paynes, Marina Oswald did, in April, and Ruth Payne then drove her to New Orleans. And then when it was time for Oswald to go into Mexico to set up his contacts with the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Department, and his double was circulating in the Soviet and Cuban embassy, while Oswald was in Mexico, Marina Oswald was driven by Ruth Payne back to their home in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. It was that home where Michael Payne was the morning after John Kennedy was assassinated, and the FBI and the police returned with a series of boxes that they had taken from the garage the day previously that weren't indexed or photographed on the spot, and Michael Payne told them to come back to the house, but he had to go to the grocery store, and it was out of that box that they pulled the negatives of the picture of Lee Harvey Oswald holding the rifle that allegedly was supposed to kill the President of the United States. Michael and Ruth Payne played a major part in the assassination of John Kennedy, in the cover-up and housing of Lee and Marina Oswald, and keeping them with the Dallas Czarist-Nazi white Russian community. And he worked with Dornberger. As soon as John Kennedy was killed, there was a telephone call from Bell Aerospace saying the communist Lee Harvey Oswald, who worked at the depository, could be a suspect. Those phone calls came right out of Dornberger's location at Bell Aerospace in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And then, of course, 2 days after Kennedy was killed, November 24th, 1963, Bell Helicopter became a major supplier of helicopters and weapons and Air Force weapons for the Vietnam War, making extensive profits out of the escalation of the war, which took place after John Kennedy was murdered Had Kennedy lived and withdrawn the troops from Vietnam, Bell Helicopter wouldn't have gone on to be one of the great aerospace industries in the United States. They went on to build helicopters and had huge contracts for the Shah of Iran. The man who owned or controlled Bell Aerospace that hired Walter Dornberger, Mr. Miller, is now Secretary of our Treasury. It was interesting. Jimmy Carter went to Venice last week to the conference of all the major nations, the NATO nations, and discussed war and peace, etc. He was supposed to take Mr. Miller, Dornberger's boss, on the airplane with him, and he didn't. And Miller was furious, this Secretary of the Treasury, and had to take a commercial airline to Europe. And there was an article in the New York Times about his literally being bounced off. I wonder if Jimmy Carter is trying to push Brzezinski and Miller and these Nazis off the warmongering team in order to cool things down and hopefully keep peace going. On the one hand, we're escalating the war every minute. On the other hand, there are little signs of some shaky business. But whatever was happening at the time Miller was bounced, that was the same time that Walter Dornberger was expiring. Walter Dornberger is a man with a background so treacherous that the British didn't want to release him to come to the United States. They thought he should be hung in Nuremberg. And many times on many tapes and radio stations, I've read a section of the book Project Paperclip by Clarence Lasby, page 113, where they described Walter Dornberger, and they said that Dornberger was a menace of the first order, that he should be left on the dust heap after the bombings in Europe and the Nazification of Europe. And the British didn't want to release him. It was Wernher von Braun who insisted that he wouldn't give us the space rockets and the rocket technology or the atomic weapon technology unless we took Dornberger to the United States. The British reminded the Americans that he was dangerous, that Pundamund experiment that they had will always be coming forward, that the Reich will be resurrected and they will return the Reich, and that Dornberger was one of these people who was untrustworthy, that he's a source of irritation and future unrest if he were sent to America. The American government didn't consider that important at all. They put him in the arms industry. The British government tried to see that he would be hung in Nuremberg, but he was released under Project Paperclip, and the book Project Paperclip explains that he got the directorship of research and development at Bell Aircraft Company, but they didn't include the fact that Bell Aircraft was in Dallas-Fort Worth area and did hire people that were directly involved later in the assassination of John Kennedy, an event that was to change the whole world and turn us around domestically and internationally once and forever. The legacy of Walter Dornberger and his kind is seen in the headlines every week. If you just take them this week: 1, missiles, planes, and ships in Senate approved $51 billion arms bill passed this week. Provisions for a new draft registration plan. The Third Reich will have us in that war against Russia that they wanted and which we want. That is a headline. New 3 Mile Island study says accident isn't over. That's the legacy of the atomic missile scientists, this type of energy where there's no way to throw out the waste, and cancer is increasing all over the country. The percentage of cancer is up tremendously, and it will continue as radiation takes over the water and the air throughout the country. Another headline: Senate passes record arms bill, and Carter orders the draft to preserve peace, right out of 1982. The legacy of Dornberger and von Braun and the Nazis that were allowed to rebuild and were built up by the Americans in the first place and continue to rebuild, the legacy they left are the headlines we have today. Last week I talked about the death of Jesse Curry, the ex-Dallas police chief who believed there was somebody behind the fence, that Oswald didn't fire the fatal gun. And when Curry died, they admitted that a week earlier the chief psychiatrist in Jack Ruby's trial, John Holbrook, had died, in quotes, had committed suicide, and he didn't believe that Jack Ruby was insane, that he had other motives for killing John Kennedy. So it seems that the Holbrook story was delayed a week until Jesse Curry died, and the Dornberger story was delayed a week, so evidently all 3 died within 1 week. And the Dornberger story hasn't hit any of the newspapers, neither did the Holbrook for a week. Somebody is holding these stories up, and they're coming out at certain times, but it's unusual also for the obituary of famous people to be delayed a week and for the news media not to carry it right away. Gerald Ford of the Warren Commission, who covered up the Czarist-Nazi connections of Lee Harvey Oswald and let the organized crime Nazis free, trying to make Oswald one lone nut. His reward keeps going on financially. He's now been appointed on the board of the Tiger International. The Tiger International, of course, is the Flying Tiger Airlines connected with Madame Chennault and organized crime, gun smuggling, narcotic smuggling, and so forth. There's a lot of money, of course, in the appointments that he's taking, and he just doesn't have to account to anybody. If he ran for president of the United States, there'd be more scrutiny into his pocket. So Gerald Ford turned down the offer to be a candidate, a presidential nominee in this next election, and instead accepted the board membership on the Flying Tigers. As they said at the press conference when he accepted this, as Gerald Ford said, "I'm delighted to be elected to the Tigers board of directors." Gerald Ford is very bright. He says transportation plays a vital role in the national and world economy. Well, transportation also plays a vital role with the Central Intelligence Agency and the profits from narcotics and gun running. He lauded the Tigers' commitment to serve the transportation needs, and it's a total transportation company and will provide a unique opportunity in the 1980s. He's correct. It is a total transportation company. It will serve anything and transport just about anything. Gerald Ford now serves on the board of the Shearson Loeb Roads Company, the Santa Fe International from Alhambra, the GK Technology Company from Greenwich, Connecticut, the GK Technology, and also the Pebble Beach Corporation. That's that piece of real estate just about 6 miles from my house here. He's on the board of directors of that, and also Grace Kelly is on the board of directors of Pebble Beach Company. It's owned by 20th Century Fox now. The president of it was a graduate of Annapolis. Mr. Stanfield is an Annapolis graduate who bought the Pebble Beach Company, and the board of directors includes Grace Kelly from Monaco with her Pennsylvania connections, and Gerald Ford with his military, Central Intelligence, of course his White House connections. Those lovely people are board directors of Pebble Beach Company. 20th Century Fox was able to get the money to buy the Pebble Beach Company by making the movie Star Wars, incidentally, which I think is interesting because one of the purposes of Star Wars was an idea of Rand Corporation to create terror about outer space and control the fear of the Russians and other people about the combat of outer space satellite conflict. This is part of the psych war of Rand Corporation, and Gerald Ford's appointment here was based on the profits that they made from the movie Star Wars, and now there's a new one out. They'll continue making them, and people will gobble it up, and then the profits go into buying up pieces of real estate choice land around the country that they can control further for their secret meetings. There's guards at the gates, and you pay $3 or $4 to go through, and every car is noticed, and it's a secret hideaway for the very rich to escape and to make future plans. Last week, the FBI was looking for James Earl Ray's brother, John Ray, because of the similarities in the attempted murder of Vernon Jordan of the Urban League, and the local authorities were confused because John Ray was supposed to be under federal custody 4 months ago and regarding an Illinois bank robbery, and he was out on the streets. As I say, the FBI suspected him of possibly playing a part in this other ambush and attempted murder. The Associated Press story said local authorities complained Tuesday that they didn't know John Ray had escaped from federal custody 4 months ago, and that he was still at large. He had been charged with an Illinois bank robbery. The first public word of Ray's escape came Monday as authorities in Illinois issued a warrant charging him in a bank robbery May the 30th. Ray left the one federal hospital in Springfield and boarded a bus and never arrived in St. Louis, and they didn't know where he was. That's interesting because I had maintained for a long time that James Earl Ray, his brother, could have substitutes in the prison, and that he could come and go and leave, and that his escape was a fake escape. He did leave, but they brought him back because of public pressure, and one of these days he would take off for good, or he didn't have to serve his full time for killing Martin Luther King, the civil rights leader. I believe that James Earl Ray can weave in and out of institutions at will, and none of us would ever know the difference because he will eventually get his payoff for killing this black leader. But the parallels come up now where his brother is supposed to be in prison and isn't, and is between various escapades and charged with bank robberies, which in fact, may not be his at all, and the money, huge amounts of money, can be donated to Minutemen and Nazi parties and clandestine activities and racist organizations. He's suggested for a $15,000 robbery in one place, $11,000 in another. Nobody knows where John Ray is half the time, and certainly nobody knows where the money is going, or even if these robberies aren't staged, and the money is allocated to people to survive on, and he keeps being the fall guy for the robberies. There's an article in the Los Angeles Times, an editorial, wanted black leadership for the 80s. It's written by Frank Viviano from Pacific News Service. He went to Miami and was doing some journalism on the riot. I suggest that he take time out, Frank Viviano, and just read the King Alfred plan and understand there is no black leadership, because if you took my files of just black murders of civil rights leaders and professors and military men or congressmen just working in the system, the black leaders have systematically been destroyed. The documents prove the intent to do it, and it's a little sick to be writing an article now, wanted black leadership for the 80s. What he should be writing is wanted persons who murdered the black leaders. On the May 23rd tape, tape number 442, I did a half of the tape on the incredible story of the Awa Maru, the sunken ship, the Red Cross ship, that was sent from Japan with the knowledge of the United States during World War II and was sunk outside of China with this multi-billion-dollar treasure, that I believe that the Glomar Explorer was built specifically to bring up and also to bring other treasures that have been sunken through the years at sea. I'm not going back over the Awa Maru. You can get that tape and other tapes that I've done on it. But there's a new issue out of Covert Action Information Bureau that's put out by Philip Agee, and I'll give you the address and where to get it. And there's a whole section there, the unanswered questions of the Glomar Explorer. And I explained on that tape that I believe that our tax money went into the CIA building the Glomar Explorer for the express purpose of then converting it to bringing up treasures that they could use for their own profit. Now, this article is by Fritzie Kohn on the Glomar Explorer. Talks about the mysterious and unresolved CIA mystery in the development of the used ship. And it goes into asking the question of why the ship was built, and that they're still very secret about the purposes or the motives. That locked up in the National Archives are affidavits from various CIA officials that to release the information on the Glomar would seriously jeopardize national security. This is signed by Stansfield Turner, Brent Scowcroft, Cyrus Vance, and CIA officials. The article goes into the Lockheed Georgia Corporation and their role in building this Howard Hughes mining barge, it was called. So there's been a lot of controversy and lawsuits pending on the Glomar Explorer because there was one ship that was sunk out of Santa Catalina Island in California a long time ago, and the man who was supposed to bring it up and receive the profits from it was beat to it by the Glomar Explorer coming there and believed to have taken this wealth. And the tax division of the Justice Department in California has been trying, it's a court case called United States versus the County of Los Angeles, to find out how much profit there is or the tax structure of the Los Angeles County Tax Office, their role in conceiving and designing the Glomar Explorer for the Hughes Company. There was a company called Global Marine that designed it for the Hughes government, and the contract was between this corporation called Global Marine and Mechanics Research. Part of it was made in Minneapolis with Honeywell, part from General Motors, General Electric, and a company in Germany, and the Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Docks Company. And the Glomar was built in 1971, and Roy Ash, who was president of Litton Industry, who had a major role of Litton Industry, and he was head of the Office of Management Budget under Richard Nixon. He is director of the Global Marine Company, which influences the U.S. executive. So there were millions of dollars of tax money, $33.5 million, Global received from our tax money to put into the Glomar. But Roy Ash, who headed Nixon's Advisory Council on Reorganization in 69 and 70, was involved not only in the contracts to that company, but he was a part of the company and director of the company. And there's a can of worms here. The real story, it was called Project Jennifer, and there's a book out on it. And I think you should get a copy or start subscribing to this Covert Journal if you don't have it. Many of you people know of it, and new listeners may not know. It's called Covert Action Information Bulletin. So what you have to do is subscribe to that and read the story on the Glomar, and then if you don't have it, get my back tape on the Glomar and the wealth that is under the sea that is going to private companies after the ships are built by our tax dollars, and the use of this tax money of ours to make private profits for them. It's a very important thing to consider when we hear all the time about welfare cheaters and cutting back on the rights, the civil rights, and the tightness of money in our local community to develop the schools and hospitals. Hospitals are closing. There's no way to collect garbage, no way to pay the teachers. Our cities are tied up, and the tax money goes into corporations such as this that just multiply their profits after we build the ships with our taxes. There's also an interesting article in the same issue on mind control, the story of Mankind Research Unlimited by A.J. Weberman. Weberman wrote the book Coup d'etat in America, and he's an excellent researcher on the Kennedy assassination, and for years he was putting me down because I was talking about mind control in the United States, as was Mark Lane, and now all of a sudden Weberman surfaces as the author of an article on mind control, and of course Lane was so involved with the Jonestown tragedy and the aftermath and the profiting of it and the concealing of the mind control experiments down in Guyana that I can see why Mark Lane was so against my talking about mind control. He told me in 1976 that if I talked about not mind control, nobody would ever believe me. I'd lose my credibility, and that's why he couldn't be seen publicly with me on any stage. And yet Jonestown was being built in 1973 and was getting ready to be inhabited by 1976 for a mind control experiment of the Central Intelligence Agency. And then Mark Lane plunks himself right down in the middle of the control experiment. So you can see why he was so angry at my working on mind control. So it's interesting that Weberman now is writing stories about the United States government and mind control. Ronald Reagan's fangs are coming out, and while I've done many, many tapes on Jimmy Carter and the narcotics connections, it's time to go to Reagan and the Hitler Tsarist drug Vegas connections and give you a sample of what you're going to get if you vote for him. Don't be so chic that you think I'll stay away from the polls and I don't like either one, so I won't vote for either one. I do want to remind you of a statement Reagan had last Sunday's paper, June 29th, in celebration of our 4th of July, which occurs today, and our freedom for the United States of America. Reagan has a charter for the Central Intelligence Agency set up by Senator Malcolm Wallop of Wyoming, W-A-L-L-O-P of Wyoming, and 5 other Republicans, Hayakawa of California, and all of them are advisors in Ronald Reagan's campaign, all 5 that want to set up a new charter for the CIA. Now, what they want to do is establish a new national office of counterintelligence. That's different from Navy Intelligence, Defense Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, Defense Industry Security Command, or Central Intelligence Agency, or FBI Division 5 Counterintelligence. He wants a new national intelligence, and this is identical to Adolf Hitler wanting his Gestapo that was separate from the German army. They want it with power to have any intelligence agency investigate any American who may be engaged in clandestine intelligence activities or terrorism or drug trafficking or international organized crime, to allow intelligence agencies to write their own guidelines. They, not Congress, not you or me, are to write their guidelines, and they would consult with Congress to open mail, burglarize electronic surveillance against Americans and foreign intelligence agents or targets without any court warrants at all. They want to split the CIA into intelligence gathering and an analytical agency, and the charter would put it in competition with the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency in preparing analysis. On the other side of this tape, I'm going to continue reading a little bit of what Ronald Reagan wants. They want to create a director of national intelligence appointed by the president without Senate confirmation, a director of national intelligence that only Reagan would appoint without confirmation from the Senate or anybody else. Some directors of the intelligence would be confirmed by the Senate for 10-year terms. Couldn't fire them like justices of the Supreme Court. This intelligence czar would have a team, 10-year terms. I'll do more about Reagan and his team on the other side of this tape. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's side 2 of tape 448, and it's July the 4th, 1980. In order to understand where Ronald Reagan is coming from, you have to go back to the historical roots of the people that selected Ronald Reagan. Their first official president, selected and groomed by this team of thinkers to prepare us for World War III, was Richard Nixon. That was their first selected candidate. Then it took a lot of murders and attempted murders to kill other candidates and witnesses, and domestic and international murders, particularly the domestic I'm concerned with here, in order to make way for Ronald Reagan to become the next selected and manipulated president of the United States. There was an article going back 1976, that's quite a while back, that I have from the San Jose Mercury, Hoover Institute, a major conservative think tank. This is an article on the influence on U.S. domestic affairs, primarily our domestic affairs, our prisons, hospitals, the so-called welfare cheaters, the racism, the killing of Chicanos and black leaders, and so forth. Goes back to the influence of the domestic affairs that was decided at Stanford University. This article, written quite a few years ago in '76, describes the Hoover Institute as the major conservative think tank on domestic, on our own personal level, outside at a time, specifically today, that we celebrate July the 4th, our independence from Great Britain. A long time ago, you wonder, well, what did we gain by fighting? Taxation without representation. We certainly have that now. And what advantage was there not to be British? If we were going to turn the route that we did, why bother to have the Revolutionary Wars or Civil Wars or any other kinds of wars? They're all ridiculous, because nothing is accomplished, and nothing proves that more than the intent to disrupt the Constitution and the Bill of Rights by an organization located in Palo Alto, such as the Hoover think tank. In 1976, that was 13 years ago, they claimed that conservatives are looking to Hoover as an antidote to the more liberal output that's coming out of Brookings Institute or Harvard. If you think Harvard is liberal, just wait till Stanford gets into the White House, the Hoover people. It goes on to say the Hoover scholars had an impact on Richard Nixon. You bet they did, and Gerald Ford, and they will on Ronald Reagan. This is talking about his bid for presidency in 1976, but after Rockefeller was murdered and Jimmy Carter was totally discredited or split up with John Anderson and Ted Kennedy's votes, the hope is now to get Ronald Reagan. The article says that Ronald Reagan joined the exiled Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn as the only 2 honorary fellows at Hoover Institute. He donated 20 tons of his State House papers to the Institute, and he does his research and writing out of the Institute. He's influenced by people, Hoover scholars, who testify before congressional committees, and they name one, a Glenn Campbell, from the University of California. Reagan named him on the regent as a regent for the University of California, and his wife is an economist and works with this Hoover group. There are so-called scholars that influence the domestic policies of the United States. Mr. Campbell, who's on the Board of Regents, took time out to be the advisor to Barry Goldwater during his campaign for presidency. The Hoover Tower was begun and founded by Herbert Hoover in 1919. As I've said many times, and it's documented in the book The Great Conspiracy and other books on Herbert Hoover's life, he had financial investment of billions in oil companies in Russia that were taken by the communists, and he wanted to avenge that and regain his personal profit. So as president of the United States, later as Secretary of Commerce, he brought us into a Great Depression, arming us. It was arms against butter in order to make war against the Soviet Union, and the momentum and the propaganda built up so much that today almost every country in the world is bankrupt, just maintaining arms enough in the hopes that they will someday conquer Russia and regain the oil and gold and minerals that they would love to have in their own pockets. A recent article came out in the Los Angeles Times, the Hoover-Reagan Campaign Resource, and it explains that Herbert Hoover got it for a bargain in 1919. It was a $50,000 gift. He founded the institution to establish and demonstrate the evils of Karl Marx, and now it provides all the intellectual underpinnings for Ronald Reagan's conservatism. The Hoover Institute on War, Revolution, and then Peace is the nation's think tank that keeps the anti-Russian information propaganda going constantly. Reagan feels at home at the Hoover Tower. This one article explains Hoover is so comfortable with him that the institution not only made him an honorary fellow member, but they will follow him to Washington when he becomes President of the United States. They collect raw material of history. They collected information ever since Hoover, President Hoover, was the relief coordinator in Europe in World War I. They keep all kinds of documents. They have the original diary of Nazi Heinrich Himmler, and they have cartons of information from Gestapo Germany. They have the list that the Gestapo had of the British people that would be rounded up for execution if the Nazis got into England. That is a repository in the tower, and of course is fed into Interpol and could be used again if these people are in power. There could be assassination squads if they're not all dead already by suicides or car crashes, airplane crashes, and so forth. The death list of the British people, which I'm sure they were never notified about, is a repository in this institution. The chief archivist is Milrad Drakovic, whose father is Minister of the Interior in Yugoslavia in the First War. In World War II government, he was assassinated by the communists, so he has a motive to get even with the Russians, not Adolf Hitler, who provoked the war, or the corporations that funded Hitler. Vasily Romanov, the nephew of the Tsar Nicholas II and Prince of Russia, is the honorary curator of this great Hoover Institute, where they have this Imperial Russian collection and the greatest amount of material outside of Russia in the world. It's hard for me to believe that I was so close to many events that were going to occur in my research later, and in my innocence, going to Stanford University for 4 years, we used to hear the bell, the tower, the Acrolon ring every hour at the Hoover Tower, and it was so beautiful. It was sent from the Netherlands, I believe, and the sound of it was very beautiful. And the farthest thing from my mind in the years 1940 to 43, the 4 years I was there, was anything that was going on in the Hoover Tower. I was a philosophy major, and I could care less, and nobody on campus was aware of the accumulation of this material being put into the tower. One of the biggest and most public persons that feeds information here and uses it for his research is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the other fellow membership, along with Ronald Reagan. A current article said Solzhenitsyn's portrait pops up everywhere in the building, as often as Herbert Hoover or Ronald Reagan's. After Solzhenitsyn's exile from Russia, President Ford, on the advice of Henry Kissinger, felt that entertaining him in the White House would ruin d'entente at the time, but he went right out to the Hoover Tower where he worked, and it was a resource. He used documents to write his novel, August 1914. Another man on the Hoover staff that you know is physicist Edward Teller, the father of the H-bomb, tax expert Dan Throop Smith, welfare expert Martin Anderson, Thomas Gale Moore, and Richard Starr. The Russian-speaking chronicler of Soviet affairs are on the board as economists. All of them will go to Washington with Ronald Reagan. Martin Anderson is a close advisor to Reagan. He's on the board of the Hoover Tower. He rides with him on the campaign plane. Darrell Trent, who held a half a dozen jobs in the Nixon White House, was Reagan's deputy campaign manager in '76 and is working for Reagan again. This is from a recent Los Angeles Times article. Hoover Director Campbell, that's the man in charge of the towers who took the lead for Barry Goldwater's campaign, has been working close with Ronald Reagan, as well as, I say, being on the Board of Regents at the University of California. You might get reprints of these articles from your local newspapers. One by Mike Fensiller that I just read from the Associated Press. There's another one from the Washington Bureau of the San Jose Mercury, Californians Guiding Ronald Reagan. And there's a picture of Lynn Nofziger, That's the gentleman that worked with John Mitchell and the American Nazi Party at the time of Watergate. Reagan has this entourage of the think tank from the Hoover Institute and the most far-right consulting firms and corporations behind him as he pushes to become president of the United States. William Casey, the gentleman that's working with Ronald Reagan, was appointed to two important jobs by Henry Kissinger at one time. I will do more on Casey later, but William J. Casey was recruited by former Treasury Secretary William Simon, and he's one of Reagan's close advisors. It's interesting that William J. Casey, formerly from the Security Exchange Commission at the time of a lot of exposés that were covered up at Watergate, claims that his interest in politics goes back to the 1940 campaign of New York Republican Thomas Dewey. Now, that was the first campaign in the 40s after the war to the use of Mary Carter Paint Company, organized crime, and the intelligence community to push a candidate for the President of the United States. That Dewey campaign was the first combined effort of the crime syndicate and the intelligence community to push for the presidency, and this is where William Casey began to get involved in political campaigns. And then Mary Carter Paint Company went on down to the Bahamas to become Resorts International and formed a corporation known Intertel. And Intertel controlled Howard Hughes, the Hughes people who wanted Paul Lazault, who's now running Reagan's campaign, the senator from Nevada, the one who's pushing that secret intelligence czar spy system. The Intertel was formed from Resorts International, and the network from William Casey in New York and the Security Exchange and Dewey, the Bahamas, Nevada, and Reagan and the think tanks is a network of intelligence persons trained in the FBI, the CIA, involved in narcotics, organized crime, Czarists-Nazis, the worst kinds of people that push pogroms in Russia, the greedy exploitation of the czars, and when they were removed, the wealth divided among the Russians, known as a form of economic alternative, known as capitalism. The Western world became frantic. Europe and Asia became frantic that Russia might give other countries the idea of divesting the power in the hands of the few and the wealth, and they set up these organizations of think tanks all over the world, but they synchronize, they synchronize when it comes to making domestic and foreign policy of causing bloodbaths in South Africa, or bloodbaths going on now in Nicaragua or Guatemala, particularly Guatemala, that is about to be wiped out, the United Fruit Company nation. And the same names of the think tanks and the czarists and Nazis and organized crime that want the intelligence system perverted, that want to take away the trial by jury with a new constitution, the same names are coming from 50 states and interlocking and weaving, and all are compiled into certain people that have been selected for the office of presidency in the United States, where the laws will protect their financial exploitation to the nth degree. The Hoover think tank for conservatives is nothing but a group of people determined to break our economy by making a war against Russia in order to divest that system of the idea of dividing wealth or natural resources among the few. The plans for the intelligence agency, for the Pentagon, come from those kind of people that are working in the Hoover think tank and running men like Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, who are puppet face men, or Gerald Ford, and a few transitional men like Jimmy Carter or Lyndon Johnson, till they get total control of the entire military and the White House and the intelligence network, like Hitler did in Germany in 1933. By overlooking the murders and perverting the court system, they come to power, and the people behind Ronald Reagan are those very people that are writing the new charter for the intelligence, FBI, and the CIA, and the private organization outside of the FBI and CIA that hasn't been named yet, but probably will be called the Gestapo. The Hoover Institute was formed in 1919, as soon as the Russian Revolution was over, just as the Broederband were formed in South Africa about the same time period, and Cecil Rhodes' Round Table in England, and our Council of Foreign Relations in the United States. There's a line in the play Tiny Alice by Edward Albee that, I don't remember verbatim, it goes, "Be careful of what you ask, because you may just get it, and your wish may come true." I think the wish of these people to conquer and make war and constantly make war is probably going to come true. And they're not going to get what they dreamed they would have. 1917 or 1919, when these plans were made and these candidates were picked, the minds and hearts of the people were very controllable, just as labor unions or labor and slave labor was controllable. But the confrontations that are going to take place are going to be bloody and many. And as the women testified just last week on the anniversary of Hiroshima and the bombings, the atomic bombs falling in Japan, they said, the living will envy the dead. Helen Douglas died this last week. Helen Cahagan Douglas. Many of you can go to books about Richard Nixon and his early career and get many, many pages on the saga of Helen Douglas. What you won't get, you'll get the stories of how Nixon called her a red and ruined her career in 1950. She was going to run for the Senate. She'd been in Congress for 6 years, a fine woman, an intelligent person. You'll get a lot of stories of the way Nixon tainted her career and ruined her political career and pushed her out of office. But what you don't get are the connecting links of the earlier years, the Czarists that were accumulating in Palo Alto in what was to become the Hoover think tank, and the chronology of this period. Earlier, as I say, in 1940, these people were hell-bent on us becoming involved in this other war and using the Germans against the Soviet Union. And in 1946, Richard Nixon, when the war was over, was selected by a committee of 100, a group of agricultural people, aerospace people, Lockheed, Howard Hughes, to run against Mr. Voorhees, a man that was in Congress. And Richard Nixon began that red smear. That's when his politics began, his debut began. There are many, many books on the subject. I have one book here by William Costello, The Facts About Nixon, the unauthorized biography of his formative years. And this goes a little bit into his power, how he got it. But it was these people that had a lot of influence in California who selected him as a front, as they selected Ronald Reagan when he was on General Electric Theater to become president of the United States someday, even if it took 400 murders to get him there. This book describes Voorhees, as I say, his election in 1946 and the red smear, and how the Committee of 100 funded Richard Nixon and put up money for him, and at the same time they were funding William Nolan's Senate campaign, this Murray Chotiner, who later was killed at the time of Watergate. And then after his successful campaign in the House of Representatives, he prosecuted Alger Hiss and became known as the great fighter of communism, and he was going full steam. You know, the McCarthy years were beginning, the blacklisting of people. And then in 1950, after they had arrested and prosecuted Alger Hiss, then a woman named Helen Douglas came along, and then he began the bigger game. This book describes he was armed by 1949, Richard Nixon, for a bigger game. He had the Alger Hiss case behind him. He proved that red smear worked, and he compared her voting record to a man who admittedly was interested in socialism or possibly communism as an alternative to the kind of capitalism we were moving towards. And then he compared her votes to this man and said, therefore, if they vote the same on certain issues, they're communists. She never could gain momentum. He had all kinds of outside money and organizations and slurs and pink stationery he used, and was working with Senator Joe McCarthy, who came in California on his behalf to speak for him. And along with him was Gerald Smith and a Christian nationalist crusade, and they came out for an Anglo-Saxon Christian meeting in support of Richard Nixon. Now, it isn't surprising that a group that I mentioned on the tape just several weeks ago wants the world all Christian, and John Connolly and Leon Jaworski and people, Clint Murchison and the Hunt brothers, people involved with the Kennedy assassination, and then the subsequent escalation of the war in Vietnam, an anti-communist crusade, while making tremendous profits all the time. These people were behind Nixon very early in his career, and Richard Nixon, of course, was at Murchison's home the night before John Kennedy was killed. November 21st, 1963, he left Love Airfield that same morning. Kennedy came in and was later killed, and then Richard Nixon appointed Gerald Ford to the Warren Commission. Gerald Smith and his Christian nationalist crusade were in Los Angeles in February 27, 1950. They told the crusade that the man that they wanted, the man who uncovered Alger Hiss, is in California, and that he would do house cleaning, and they would help Richard Nixon get rid of the Jew communists. This was part of his campaign. And part of the campaign of Gerald Smith was that Helen Douglas was the wife of a Jew. And you Californians can do one thing, he said, to help the ideals of Christian nationalism. Don't send to the Senate the wife of a Jew. This is part of Richard Nixon's campaign in 1950, running and working with the China lobby. They also were part of his campaign in 1950, the China lobby that was violently anti-communist, anti-change in the Chinese government, supporting Chiang Kai-shek. And, of course, that China lobby goes into Madame Chennault and the Flying Tigers, and Gerald Ford, again of the Warren Commission, is now on the board of directors of the Flying Tigers. As I say, there are many books on Nixon's career, but if you separate the Alger Hiss case and the McCarthy years and the Rosenberg case, or the Richard Nixon career, the War of Vietnam or Korea, or getting ready for World War III in the Middle East now, if you separate our weapons contracts, our missiles and planes contracts this week, the $51.9 billion allocation, the new draft registration, the escaping of radiation in Pennsylvania, 3 Mile Island, if you separate those as separate incidences, you're missing the point of history, because there is a linear connection of persons and places involved in the past that, as I say, write our headlines today. In this one book, The Facts About Nixon, there is the epilogue of Nixon's career written in January 1957. A British publisher went to Richard Nixon and asked him about his campaign against Helen Douglas, and he explained his campaign against Helen Douglas was, he said, "I'm sorry about it. It was a mistake," in quotes. "I'm sorry about that episode. I was a very young man." In order to become president, he had to publish those pink sheets and the slur, because the people putting him in office needed it to get him into office. 1950 was the year that Nixon defeated Helen Douglas on the red smear. He started with Voorhees in 46, and this country ever since, and since World War II, has been going, actually since World War I, has been going gung-ho to help the Nazis, help the anti-communists, such as people coming in from Cuba, not wanting people coming in from Haiti or Chile or Argentina. Fascist repressive governments or South African governments are not people. If they are fighting fascism, they are considered human fodder and animal. If they fight communism, they're welcome. What was happening in 1950? I was just looking up some information in the Encyclopedia Britannica. In the front of it, they have each year a chronology of what transpired the year before. And I just thought a few of these items might be of interest to you. At the time that Nixon was defeating Helen Douglas, January the 8th, Attorney General John Howard McGrath stated that he supported wiretapping by the FBI because of the emergency which still existed in the United States. This was 30 years ago, the news of 1950. Alger Hiss was found guilty by a federal grand jury of perjury. He denied passing documents to Whittaker Chambers and denied seeing Whittaker Chambers in January the 1st, 1937. And, of course, later it turns out that Chambers had contacts in Germany and with Henry Luce in Life magazine, and was set to detract or take away from the work that Alger Hiss was doing in exposing the rearmament of Germany in 1937 and the use of the DuPonts and Mellons and Morgans to arm Europe for World War II. That was Alger Hiss's crime. January the 28th, there was an agreement by Harry Truman to furnish $1 billion for U.S. arms to Belgium, Denmark, France, United Kingdom, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway. It was signed in Washington, D.C. President Truman also directed the U.S. Atomic Energy to continue work on all forms of atomic weapons, including the so-called hydrogen bomb or the super bomb, that in 1950. February the 8th, the Secretary of State Dean Acheson told a press conference that any agreements with Russia were worthless unless they were backed by strength and backed by force. And the men who made the strength and made the force were the Committee of 100 and the arms merchants from the east to the west, who made money building weapons and telling us we needed these weapons while they profited into the new millionaires and billionaires, the Daniel Ludwigs, the Howard Hughes, the aerospace, Roy Ash, Litton Industries, Boeing, Lockheed, Rockwell. The new millionaires are the defense millionaires. February 26th, General MacArthur announced that Japan would be permitted to join in international agreements with technical conferences. This was a year after the atomic bomb. U.S. High Commissioner John J. McCloy in 1950 warned Germany that we would use power and influence to head off the revival of Nazism, and 7 years later, McCloy in 1957 released all Nazis from prisons and jails to continue their national and international meetings to rearm for World War III. And John J. McCloy, of course, was on the Rockefeller Foundation, head of Chase Manhattan Bank, and on the Warren Commission with Allen Dulles to cover up the use of the Nazis and the Czarists in the killing of John Kennedy for the purposes of escalating the war and taking hold to rearm this country into the warfare state it is today. March 1950, Attorney General Howard McGrath and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover refused to turn over to the Senate any part of their files on State Department or personnel accused of disloyalty. You could continue with McCarthy hearings and political campaigns accusing people of being spies and being disloyal, and the Attorney General and the FBI would not disprove those allegations or those smears. They refused to turn to the Senate any information so that public officials could continue to campaign and make aspersions about socialist or communist linkings such as Helen Douglas, but the Attorney General and the Director of the FBI would not support or deny these claims. They wouldn't turn them over. Former President Herbert Hoover, who had formed his Tower, a think tank in 1919 for domestic policies, proposed that the United Nations be reorganized by 1950. This was 4 years after the war, without any communist participation. No communists could be there. Truman rejected that proposal. June the 1st, President Truman asked Congress for $225 billion, $500 million for more military aid to foreign countries during his second year of mutual defense assistance program. At the beginning of the year, they only allocated $1 billion, but they went up billions for the new defense system for other countries, and the Atomic Energy Commission in that year named E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company to build and operate plants for production of the hydrogen bomb. And of course, the president of DuPont, Mr. Shapiro, is on the Trilateral Committee and is a cabinet member of Jimmy Carter's campaign. And July 17th of 1950, Julius Rosenberg was arrested on charge of conspiracy to commit espionage on behalf of the Soviet Union, and then the Rosenberg case escalated as another cause célèbre to keep going after Russia. And in 1950, we were back in Asia, or getting our foot in Asia, rather, with entering the Korean War. I'm not going to do all the major events of 1950. Let's just do a half a year to show you the intent of peace was never there. By 1950, when the war was over, it had been over 5 years since 1945, when the troops went into Germany, the East and West Russian and American troops. The intent of public officials right then and there was to always be anti-Soviet, arm the other countries, leave the Russians out of discussions and so forth, armed to the teeth, and prepare ourselves for that final push that Napoleon couldn't do and Alexander the Great couldn't do, the Germans couldn't do twice, and deplete the United States of its technology, its citizens, its wealth, its sanity, literally taking away their minds, mind control experiments, and chemicals to control masses, to get them to be willing robots, which most people are today, to maintain a warfare status against an enemy that was created for the sole purpose of profits. The Soviet Union has always been the object of fear for all the major countries where the profit system was the greatest, where you get the greatest gap between the rich and the poor. Communism is feared the most. The countries where there is not that large gap, communism isn't feared as much because the rich people don't have that much to lose. Bergs were executed. It was just an anniversary, 1957, June 22nd. I should have mentioned it last week on the tape of the week before. They were executed in 1953 for passing along secret information, which later is very much questioned. And the Rosenberg story, like the Alger Hiss story, the Richard Nixon story, the Ronald Reagan story, have never truthfully been told. Speaking of the Rosenbergs, Judge Kaufman, who prosecuted and meted out the death sentence to the Rosenbergs, instead of allowing them to live to find out if in fact there was a spy ring or if they were framed, finally resigned from the bench in New York City. He's been on there about 22 years. He's done enough damage, and he finally has stepped down. It's just a shame there isn't more time. I have about 80 more stories to go through with you next week. I'll maybe speed them up without so much opinion, but I feel very strongly that sometimes, in addition to just taking the news isolated and throwing it out at you, I have to throw in my own feelings about it and the connecting links and the dangers that we're facing in the future. These elections are the elections that the Gestapo wanted. This is the 1933 of America, and Reagan is the Gestapo. The only difference between this and Nazi Germany is that there are more people aware now of the problems, and there's more knowledge of resistance, and there's more anger and frustration. There's more journalists alert. There's more people fighting to make their children survive, and it isn't identical to the past. It's a different ball game, and we still have a few freedoms, and we're going to lose them, but we'll fight for them and form resistance movements. But there is a different kind of energy that can possibly destroy these people, but you have to first be alert to the problems. In order to stop them, you have to analyze what they're doing and how they got there, and that, of course, is the purpose of these tapes every week. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. You take care, and I'll be back with you next week.